Okay, so I wanted to then move on to our first presenter, which is online presentation from Linnia Hawkins. Linnia is a postdoctoral research fellow from Columbia, but her office is at NCAR in Boulder, Colorado. So she sits there and works with the NCAR team. And her work is focused on changing climate and its impact on forest ecosystems, specifically in terms of heat, aridity, and drought. And her work is using both data and models. The current lead project that she's going to talk about is how do we use data to set the parameters of the community land model. And so we're really excited to hear about that. And lastly, Linnia received her PhD in 2019 from Oregon State University. So Linnia has the floor for the next half hour or so, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Take it away.
Thanks, Galen. I appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all about our work and give this progress update. I'm more than happy to have this be a very informal discussion, so please feel free to raise hands or interject with questions as I go through. So I'm going to be talking, as Galen mentioned, about our work here at NCAR in collaboration with LEAP to develop methods for calibrating or estimating the parameters for the land component of the Community Earth System model. And this work is in collaboration with Katie Dagan, Daniel Kennedy, Pierre Gentine, and Dave Lawrence. So one of LEAP's directives is to establish these systematic machine learning-based methods for calibrating Earth system models. And I think we're really at this opportune moment to harness some recent scientific advancements and truly improve the way that we tune Earth system models. So historically, we've been somewhat limited by our computational capacity, and then we could only run a limited number of model simulations. And so we had these small ensembles of Earth system model simulations where we would vary different parameters. But given that computational constraint, it limited the number of parameters we could investigate and which observational targets we could prioritize. And recently, we've seen a significant advancement in our computational capacity, and that has enabled us to run much larger ensembles of model simulations where we make these strategic perturbations to model parameters. And the second advancement is that these Earth observing networks and observational products are really rapidly expanding, and importantly, they're becoming more readily available and accessible via cloud storage and computing. And then third, these are really high dimensional problems, and so machine learning algorithms have emerged as valuable tools for these high dimensional data-driven tasks, such as parameter estimation. So given these recent advancements, we think LEAP is really well positioned to develop methods for more accurate and efficient model tuning. So we are focused on the land component of the Community Earth System model called the Community Land Model, or CLM. And this model represents many physical, biological, and chemical processes. It has high complexity, and we're consistently adding complexity to it, always adding new process representation, and that increases the number of parameters. And I think land models in general have a really high dimensional and complex parameter space. CLM has more than 200 parameters, and some of those are more well constrained than others. However, there are many different sources of uncertainty that contribute to the overall parametric uncertainty of land models, a community land model. One is that we just still have incomplete understanding of how to represent and parameterize some of the physics and biology in these models. Another source of parametric uncertainty is that there's often insufficient observations that may be limited in space and time, that may be limited by just a few observations at a couple sites. There's also many processes represented in CLM that we don't observe or can't observe yet. So that's another source of uncertainty. And then another is just how we represent subgrid heterogeneity in these models. I'll talk a little bit more about how we represent plant functional types later on, but that's another source of parametric uncertainty as well. So given all of this uncertainty in our parameters, that it contributes to the overall uncertainty in our projections of future climate, because the land plays such an important role in carbon cycling and feedbacks onto the atmosphere. So there have been some recent studies that have quantified this partially the parameters uncertainty as well as the model structural uncertainty. This study on the left from Aurora et al. Shows the cumulative atmosphere land flux. So that's the amount of carbon absorbed or taken up by the land surface out of the atmosphere in response to a 1% increase in CO2 year over year from a set of CMEP6 models. And there's just a really large spread in this cumulative land flux. And this is due to uncertainty in both the land model structure as well as its parameters. And then another study from Bonin and Dooney 2018 shows that they compared the relative contribution of 3 sources of uncertainty: internal variability, model uncertainty, and scenario uncertainty. And the land model is really dominated by that model uncertainty, which is, again, a combination of structure and parameters. So we're seeing that, if we can develop these systematic methods for constraining our parametric uncertainty, we can likely reduce some of our uncertainty in the projected feedbacks in the carbon cycling between the land and the atmosphere. But there are many barriers to developing these systematic model calibration methods. I talked about in our increasing complexity, but a lot of those processes interact within the model. I mentioned that land models have this really large and poorly constrained parameter space. And historically, these have been really cost prohibitive, in part because spin-up in the land model is so computationally intensive, right? It takes a really long time for soil carbon pools to come into equilibrium with a new set of parameters. And so that spin-up was a big chunk of the computational expense of running perturbed parameter ensembles. And then I mentioned also that there's a lot of uncertainty in our observations. There's also uncertainty in model structure. And then there's challenges in developing these methods that remove some of the subjectivity in our model tuning process. So while we've worked at some of these, we've worked to overcome, Katie Dagan and Daniel Kennedy developed a really nice tool for doing rapid spin-up, which helps alleviate some of the computational costs, and develop some other infrastructure to make these types of large ensembles possible with the community land model. And there are a lot of benefits to developing these systematic model calibration methods. First and foremost, parameter estimation is just a fundamental part of model development. And it's going to become even more important as we start to integrate some of our new machine learning-based parameterizations into the land model. We want to be able to test how those interact with other components. And then also, as we start to run these models at different resolutions, high resolution, variable resolution, having an ability to quickly estimate parameters for that new resolution will be really helpful. And then second, for actionable science. So Earth system models are really increasingly being used for actionable science. And often those types of studies take place at small scales, site level, regional level. And we want to ensure that CLM is easily deployable as a tool for these types of studies. And so we want to be able to estimate parameters for a specific domain or a specific resolution again, or specific region of the world. So again, having these methods in place will be really, will help support our actionable science efforts as well. Third, as we move towards a more unified modeling system, it's going to be important that we maintain a hierarchy of model complexity. And parameter estimation tools will be helpful as we start piecing together and coupling different components of the land model, or like developing these application-specific model configurations, we'll want to, again, employ these parameter estimation tools for each different model configuration. And then lastly, just parameter estimation can be used to quantify and constrain our parametric uncertainty, which really helps guide model advancement and also constrain our future projections, which I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of my intro to why we're doing this type of work and the motivations for it. I'm going to now talk through our approach and the methodology that we've been developing in the last few months. So a standard workflow for parameter estimation might look something like this. First, we generate a large perturbed parameter ensemble where we strategically vary a subset of model parameters and run an ensemble of simulations. We can then establish our observational target and calculate the error and construct a cost function. And then the next step is to train a machine learning based emulator. And that is basically a tool that serves as a really computationally inexpensive, cheap and fast proxy for the original community land model, the more computationally intensive and slow forward model. And that having an emulator allows us to explore the parameter space more thoroughly. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we use the emulator to constrain our plausible parameter space by ruling out regions of parameter space that don't match our satellite observations, for example. And then once we've constrained our posteriors, we can then optimize or calibrate the model for a specific application. So one of the main lessons learned over the last year, for me anyway, has been that this emulator step is really key. We need to make sure that our emulators are giving us accurate estimates of the relationship between our model parameters and the variable or the error metric that we're trying to reduce or calibrate to. And I've found that our emulators do a much better job of estimating the model relationship between those parameters and the variables if we don't first, if the cost function is not too complex, if the cost function isn't a compound variable that's composed of different error metrics. So what our solution to that has been is to flip the order of operations here. So we are trying to keep the emulation step as close to the raw model output as possible, because that helps retain the physical relationship between the parameters and the variables that CLM outputs, right? Even just by taking an error metric, the root mean squared error, the bias, we're sort of confounding that relationship between the parameter setting and the model behavior. So that's our first lesson learned, is like switching this order of operations has been helpful, and we've seen a lot of improvement in our emulator performance. So I'll just step through the workflow that we've developed from here. First, we generate a perturbed parameter ensemble. We identified 32 parameters that are most influential on leaf area using Daniel Kennedy's one at a time model perturbation experiment. That's been really valuable as a tool to down sample from the original 200 dimensional parameter space. We then select 500 unique combinations of those 32 parameters using a Latin hypercube sampling scheme. And we run that 500 member ensemble from 1850 to 2014 after spin-up. And we use prescribed atmospheric forcings from a reanalysis product for those simulations. And so this is what our ensemble looks like in global annual average leaf area and gross primary productivity. The default model is here in black. Default parameterization of CLM is in black. And then each point represents one of these 500 ensemble members. And so it's pretty centered on the default model. A lot of our parameter ranges are centered on that default value. And it overlaps our observational target. These This is just a rough estimate of where a few different satellite products estimate the global annual average leaf area and gross prime productivity. So we're achieving a really large spread with this perturbed parameter ensemble. So this next step is to jump straight to training our emulators. And an emulator is just a tool for effectively interpolating between the ensemble members that we ran. So these red points represent our original Latin hypercube samples, the 500 samples that we have in this, I'm just showing a two-dimensional parameter space here. And we train a Gaussian process emulator to effectively interpolate between these points. And then we've used the emulators to more thoroughly explore the parameter space and quantify parameter sensitivity, as well as detect interactions between different parameters and identify non-linearities in different response metrics to parameter adjustments. So the second kind of lesson learned along the way that we've found is that our emulators will perform better if this response surface is not too complex. And what I mean by that is we often want to emulate many variables or the whole globe. And so we often construct these, again, compound response surfaces that we're trying to emulate. That might be, in our example, it might be a combination of leaf area and gross prime productivity or photosynthesis. Or another example is that, we might have leaf area in the tropics and leaf area in the boreal forests, for example. And rather than constructing, a compound function of those variables that we're trying to emulate, we've found that it's much more effective if we use an ensemble of emulators that each perform a really specific task well. So in this example, I might have one emulator that gives me leaf area in the tropics because I expect there to be a slightly different relationship between the input parameters and the leaf area in the tropics in comparison to the second emulator, which might be, for example, the relationship represents the relationship between the parameters and the leaf area in the boreal forest. So by using this ensemble of emulators approach, we can kind of tease out the different model responses, how the model might respond differently, and capture those unique relationships between both different variables, so leaf area or GPP, and also different regions of the world. And again, we found that this ensemble of emulators approach has improved our emulator prediction, which has improved our parameter estimation workflow. So you may recognize this from Dave Lawrence's talk earlier this year. The next step is to constrain our plausible parameter space. And we were running into this challenge where some regions of the world, tropical rainforests, we may need to turn the gross prime productivity down. And in other regions, temperate grasslands, we might need to turn the gross prime productivity up. And so we're finding that it was challenging, if not impossible, to identify combinations of parameters that achieved both of those improvements in the model without degrading other regions. So for example, if we select these orange ensemble members that perform well in this temperate seasonal forest, there's no guarantee that those are going to perform well in the rainforest or in the temperate grassland. And so there are, we could have come to some compromise and said we're happy with some error across all three of these, and we end up balancing that error somehow. But instead, we wanted to take a different approach. And so we designed some experiments to test whether we can tune our plant functional type parameters independently. And so a little bit of background on plant functional types, land models represent groups of species, and we call those groups plant functional types. So for example, a needleleaf evergreen temperate tree is a group of species like pines and spruce that all are needle leaf and evergreen and live in these temperate regions of the world. Another PFT might be broadleaf deciduous tropical trees or broadleaf deciduous temperate trees. So again, there's a climate component here. There's a phenological component, evergreen, deciduous, as well as a plant structural component, needle leaf, broadleaf. And so the community land model has 15 different plant functional types. And there are a subset of the parameters in the model that can be set to unique values for each different plant functional type. So for example, the photosynthetic capacity of a needle leaf evergreen tree might be different than the photosynthetic capacity for a broadleaf deciduous tree. And we wanted to design a parameter estimation workflow that allows for those PFT specific parameters to be perturbed independently of one another. And so importantly, we're optimistic about this approach because we found that the plant functional type parameters are a dominant source of variability in our perturbed parameter ensemble. So just for an example, I'm showing the needle-leaf evergreen tree, and this is a distribution in the bias in leaf area. And when I perturb all 32 of my parameters in my ensemble, I get a distribution in gray, which is quite wide. But if I only perturb the 12 PFT specific parameters, I get the distribution in orange. And that is about more than 3/4 of the full range of that full ensemble. So we're encouraged that if we can design and come up with an experimental design that allows for independent PFT parameter perturbations, we'll be able to turn, for example, this high bias in needle leaf evergreen tree, we'll be able to turn that bias down while also, alleviating this negative bias in broadleaf deciduous temperate trees. So we can turn things in opposite directions, which will help us with our spatial, some of our spatial challenges. Okay, so what we've been working on most recently is designing an experimental structure that allows for this independent PFT tuning. But that has historically been challenging because there are 15 plant functional types in CLM, and of our 32 parameters, 20 of them are what I'm calling universal parameters. That means they have to be set to one value and they don't vary by PFT. Those are, for example, like soil parameters. And then there are 12 PFT specific parameters. These are the ones that can vary. And so if we're to treat each PFT specific parameter independently, the full factorial experiment would be just way too large. We wouldn't have, we wouldn't have 15 times 12 plus 20, and we would need way larger of a initial Latin hypercube ensemble. And that's just computationally infeasible. And then the second challenge here is that these universal parameters, they interact with the PFT specific parameters. So while the Medellin, for example, this Medellin slope parameter can be set to different values for all of these PFTs, they all interact with some of the universal parameters, like some of the soil parameters I mentioned earlier that determine water availability. So that means that we can't just tune the universal parameters first and then go in and tune these PFT specific parameters second. We have to do it simultaneously in order to retain the interactions between those universal and PFT specific parameters. So this is where our ensemble of emulators approach has come in useful. We are training as different emulator for each plant functional type. Here I'm just showing the 3 PFTs I was focusing on earlier. This is a validation of the PFT specific emulators. And I'm getting just unbelievably good performance out of these emulators, in my opinion, for these PFT specific relationships. And that's in part, again, because we're retaining a more physical relationship between the parameters, which are PFT dependent, and in this case, spatial mean of the annual max of leaf area only on that PFT. We're using Gaussian process emulators and using the GPFlow Python package. So by training these independent PFT emulators, we can treat them all separately, but we have to make sure that they're predicting using the same sample of our universal parameter sets, because we can only choose one universal parameter set. So that's where our sampling design comes in. So the approach we've taken is to just take a 10,000 member random sample of our universal parameters. And then for each of those universal samples, we pair it with a unique PFT specific sample. So we have 1,000 for every one of the 10,000 samples. So combined, that gives us 10 million parameter sets per PFT. And we have our emulator each emulator predict those same 10 million sets for each plant functional type. I should mention here also, just to keep this in mind, the broadleaf deciduous temperate tree emulator is not doing as well as the others, and I'll come back to that later. It's a R-squared of about 0.87. So we use our emulators to inflate our sample size, and then we have to throw out any of those ensemble members that aren't within our observational tolerance. And the way I've sampled that is by only selecting members of this universal sample in which there's at least one combination of parameters for all 15 PFTs that's within the observational tolerance. And that ensures that I don't select a universal set for which I can't get like C4 grass within its observational tolerance, right? So I'm just making sure that when I downsample, there's at least one combination of PFT specific parameters that gets me within the observational tolerance. And so I chuck all the ones that don't qualify, and then I'm left with like still thousands of possible combinations. And I just randomly selected a handful of those and reran CLM. And so I'm going to show some results from just one of my parameter sets that was within my tolerance, or in this history matching terminology, it would be within my not ruled out yet space. So here are these maps I showed earlier of the leaf area bias for the default community land model for these 3 PFTs I've been focusing on. Needleaf evergreen temperate tree had a really high bias, and we were pretty easily able to reduce the bias in that plant functional type. Similarly, same story for broadleaf deciduous temperate tree. And this is a bit easier because, all of these points are pretty dark blue, right? There's a high bias in most all of the grid cells here. So I'm really just taking this annual mean and trying to turn the whole annual mean, the whole spatial mean, down. And that's, resulting in pretty good reductions in bias. But for something more that has more spatial complexity, like the broadleaf deciduous temperate tree, some regions have positive biases and some regions have negative biases. And again, this is the PFT where the emulator was not performing as well, and the emulator uncertainty was quite high. And here we're actually, arguably making the model worse. So this to me tells me that I need to, there's two ways I can improve this. One, add spatial complexity to our emulators. And I'll talk more about our approach for that. And then 2, I could add some ensemble members to constrain the uncertainty in the emulator in this like narrower region of parameter space, right? A 500 member ensemble in 32 dimensional space is just really, really sparse. And we may need to add a few ensemble members to improve our emulator, to reduce the emulator uncertainty here. So, but my takeaway from this is that it's really encouraging to see that we can design a a parameter estimation experimental design that allows for a common universal parameter set and PFT independent tuning that's improving our model performance. And this is, again, just one variable, and it's just a kind of test case, but I think is a reasonable proof of concept that this workflow has promise. So just to kind of summarize my progress update to this point, we've generated this large Latin hypercube perturbed parameter ensemble with 32 parameters. And I think we've improved our emulation methodology. Those 2 points I made earlier, we've seen the emulator performance improves when we design emulation tasks that retain the physical relationships between parameters and processes. And then second, our ensemble of emulators approach has shown better performance than when we just used a single emulator for some compound error metric. And then third, we've demonstrated that we can design a parameter estimation workflow that allows for these independent PFT parameter tuning, for those PFT parameters to be tuned independently. But that approach preserves the interactions between our universal parameters and PFT parameters. And next steps for this work, we need to incorporate PFT parameter relationships. So in our most recent experiment, I just treated all the parameters as though they were independent, but we know that that's not true from an ecological perspective, right? We know that plants evolve and those traits are coordinated and both within different parameters within a plant functional type, as well as the way that a single parameter is represented across plant functional types. So we need to build those relationships into our sampling scheme. And I'm working with some ecologists and folks at NCAR and other land modelers to build out a way to sample that retains some of these leaf economic theory and ecological dependencies among parameters. And then the second next step we're working on is to integrate space and time into our parameter estimation workflow. And there's two trajectories that we're pushing forward right now. One is we're exploring these what are termed meteorologically augmented Gaussian process emulators. And that's where we treat each grid cell as a unique in a unique ensemble member, and add the temperature, precipitation, some soil factors maybe as predictors in our emulator. And so that way we can actually build in the relationships between, we can allow for specific relationships between parameters and leaf area under certain climate conditions. And then the second approach we're exploring is to leverage these variational autoencoder methods for space and time reduction. And then we would train our emulators in latent space. And I haven't explored much with that yet, but that's another potential option. And then lastly, I just want to mention that the parameter estimation focus group has a GitHub repository where we are compiling these different perturbed parameter experiments, one from the community land model, one from GIS, and we're trying to add the CAM, community atmosphere model, PPE, and we have scripts on there that allow you to run some of our emulation tools and this parameter estimation workflow on the LEAP Pangeo hub. And so that's all I have for my update today. I'm happy to take questions if there's time.